It's my great pleasure to moderate the next panel discussion on the topic of democracy and human rights in the digital sphere. So the aim of this panel is to discuss some of the pressing challenges to democracy and human rights online, the role of different stakeholders in combating detrimental practices in this area, and to highlight some measures that can help protect a free and open internet. And to do this, we invited 4 speakers who can provide a variety of theoretical, empirical, and practical insights into these topics. So we have Grant Baker here with us, who is a research analyst for technology and democracy at Freedom House. He covers Europe and Eurasia for Freedom on the Net, Freedom House's annual survey and analysis of internet freedom around the world. Joining us online again is Michal Kosinski for the second time today, an associate professor in organizational behavior at Stanford University Graduate School of Business. His research focuses on individual differences in behavior, preferences, and performance, more specifically on the mechanisms linking psychological traits with a broad range of organizational and social outcomes. And we had a pleasure to hear Michal's keynote lecture earlier this morning. Also with us is Ljubisha Bojic, a research fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, whose diverse research agenda revolves around the topics of recommender algorithms, echo chambers, social polarization, misinformation, and media addiction, among other things. And finally, Professor Susan Perry is joining us online. She is a specialist in international human rights law and digital technology who teaches law and politics at the American University of Paris. As a scholar and activist, Susan's work focuses on vulnerable populations, women, children, and communities in conflict, whose rights are being violated by the state, society, or industry, often in breach of binding legal conventions. Of course, a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for participating in this panel. And I want to start things off with Grant, who is well positioned to give us a global perspective on this topic, because Freedom House has been systematically surveying internet freedom across the world for more than a decade. And the main tendency recorded in their Freedom on the Net report is a global decline in internet freedom year after year in terms of obstacles to access, limits on content, and violations of user rights. And while there are many factors contributing to this trend, what practices do you see as particularly harmful at the moment, and what should we keep an eye on in the future when it comes to limitation of internet freedom?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and also apologies. I forgot my name tag today, of course, on the day that I'm speaking. So first, I'll just start by giving some background on the Freedom on the Net report. So we measure internet freedom, which is the idea that the same human rights that we think about offline should be protected online. And the report covers 70 countries, so it's not fully global, but it covers about 89% of the world's internet users. And as Chudamir mentioned, we're looking at limits to access, limits on content, and then restrictions on individual rights, like privacy and free expression. So in each country we cover, we work with local researchers and organizations to help produce the report. In Serbia, for instance, we work with Share Foundation. So I just want to give, we're very grateful to those researchers because our report wouldn't be possible without them. And yeah, internet freedom, we found it declined for the 12th straight year this year. And that means that 28 countries declined, 26 countries improved, and the rest of the countries stayed the same. China remains the world's worst environment for internet freedom, which I'm sure won't surprise many of you. And then Iceland ranks the best, followed by Estonia and Costa Rica. And one of the biggest declines this year, again, unsurprisingly, was in Russia. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the government blocked access to social media platforms, blocked a ton of VPNs, passed legislation that had prison sentences for up to 15 years for people who, quote unquote, knowingly spread false information. Myanmar was also another large decline. People are often disappeared and given long prison sentences over their online speech. And now I kind of want to turn to one of the main themes that we found that was driving this decline this year, and that's internet fragmentation. So it's the idea that, you know, governments are trying to have more control over the online space and erode a free and open internet. And obviously, you know, the free and open internet has always been aspirational to a degree. There's always been, you know, control and limits, but we found that it's really accelerating this year. And, you know, in a lot of cases, it's driven by authoritarian governments, but democratic governments are also contributing as well. So we really looked at three main drivers of internet fragmentation. And one was the centralization of infrastructure. So this obviously has really high societal and economic costs. You see it in China in the Great Firewall, but you also see other governments like Russia and Iran moving to exert more control over infrastructure to limit content online. And then we also saw kind of limits on flows of cross-border data. So a lot of data localization laws, you know, and these pose threats to user privacy in a lot of cases. And, you know, frankly, the flow of data across borders is really critical for the internet to work. So an example here would be in a country like Rwanda, where the data protection law requires data to be stored in country. And, you know, this is in a context where activists have been prosecuted for their messages on messaging apps. So the idea that this data is now stored in country is really concerning. And then finally, we found that over 2/3 of governments that we cover tried to put limits on access to foreign content. So, you know, in the authoritarian context, obviously Russia is a clear one, by blocking, you know, major social media platforms immediately after the invasion. People have kind of less access to, you know, global information, and it gives the state the ability to more easily manicure the online media environment. But, you know, it's also happening in democracies. Australia in January of this year passed the Online Safety Act, which gives the government more power to block websites, limit access to information, and places a lot of burdens that will make it harder for small and medium-sized companies to kind of innovate and challenge some of the bigger platforms that we know and use. So those were kind of the main trends that we saw. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much for this important introduction. And at this point, I would like to bring in Michal, whose keynote lecture we heard this morning. And Michal, your research often attracts a lot of public attention for highlighting existing privacy threats of facial recognition technology, for example, and the same was the case this morning when we heard your lecture, in which you spoke, among other things, about how available facial recognition algorithms are better than human judges in predicting personality characteristics, sexual orientation, and even political leaning on a person based solely on their face photo. And one thing that I found very interesting, obviously there was a lot of attention for that talk, and people were discussing the implication of your findings later on during the break. And what I overheard during the break is people talking about the implications and asking the question that even though you mentioned that in most cases, I think you said in 99% of the cases, algorithms are used for our benefit, but then there is this 1% that is being used for harmful purposes. And I heard people asking, like, then can we easily dismiss this argument just because it's such a small percentage of negative usage? And should we and could we so easily give up on our demand for privacy and demand for regulation? And I want to ask you, could you speak more on that point and address this kind of comment?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me again. So first of all, I want to say that however small is the fraction of abuse that is happening, we should absolutely not accept it and just move on. If we have majority of nuclear power plants working well, but in one of those plants, the norms or rules are not obeyed, and we have an explosion, this is just going to be very bad. And the same pertains to our rights and rights online. our right to privacy, our right to freedom to access information, and so on. Now, also, let's not forget that the size of this environment, we have over 5 billion people now using digital products and services and being interconnected. Even tiny effects affecting 5 billion people are going to have tremendous repercussions. So while I focus on studying the negative aspects, or mainly focus on studying negative aspects of digital products and technologies, and this is what my talk was about, I just wanted to finish on a somewhat optimistic note, saying and acknowledging essentially that most of those technologies are used most of the time for our benefit. But it's not just the optimism that motivated me to bring up the benefits of those algorithms, but also the sheer fact that they are so useful and have so many advantages, both to citizens and societies, but also to those who control and deploy them, such as big tech companies, governments, and startups. Those advantages essentially mean that it's very difficult to imagine the world where those algorithms go away and are not being used. So that's in reference to your point about whether it's okay potentially to accept this 1%. Now, the second question relates to our right to privacy. Well, I've been born behind Iron Curtain and spent the first few years of my life in the context which really made me realize and value privacy. And in fact, my research was motivated by the idea that many people had in early 2000s, that if we just do the right thing, if we just develop right technologies and right policies, maybe potentially we would just strengthen the privacy and remove those risks that technologies and algorithms are presenting us with. And unfortunately, the more I study the technology, the more the technology progresses, the more it becomes clear to me that while we, of course, can limit the damage, I think it's virtually impossible to imagine the future in which privacy of individuals can be guaranteed, which I don't find to be a positive outcome, but I think it's an outcome that we should accept as very highly likely and possible, and then try to get ready for the post-privacy world. So not only fight for protection of the privacy, but also try to think about how to make sure that even this post-privacy world is still a habitable place to live. And I also want to, I mentioned during my keynote, but I just mentioned really quickly here, that privacy itself is very often just a fig leaf, just a fix for other deeper societal problems, such as biases, prejudice, homophobia, lack of legal protections for minorities. And I want to say that in many cases, we are making progress in addressing those societal problems without invoking and using privacy. For example, if we told women that the solution to the problem of sexism is just to hide our gender, that first of all would not be a respectful solution to the diversity that two or more genders that can be freely expressed in the society and not hidden adds to the lives of individuals and societies. But also the privacy is just not the real solution. The real solution is to build societies where genders have equal rights and opportunities. And privacy is not a solution to this problem. It's just a fig leaf that we use in other contexts, such as homophobia or political intolerance, to hide its actual deep problem. And I should probably stop here and hand the microphone back.
Thank you so much, Michal. And at this point, I think it will be interesting to include Lyubisha, who has extensive experience in researching media addiction. And in one of your recent papers on metaverse, you make a connection between media addiction and new relations of power in society. Can you talk more about this proposition and address potential implications of media addiction to human rights and democracy in a digital society?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I would like, first of all, I would like to say that, as Michal Kosinski said, we cannot escape AI and this new environment in which we live in, because this is a new ideology and people are, delegating different kind of things and tasks to AI, and they trust AI. This is the new currency of tokens instead of money. So I think that people believe they believe in technology as a new religion in some way. And that is one of the reasons why we cannot escape it. We cannot decide we don't want to use it. It is some kind of evolution. And this is what I write in a book about culture organism. This is like a culture organism that goes through some phases of evolution. And now the digitalization is increasing and intends to increase more. And we may live in a society of sensors where, as Kosinski says, different types of data help to improve our lives. But also on the other side, I'm worried that these new data and calculations of algorithms also limit our creativity, imagination. And what if we went to the future and, you just travel by a machine to travel to the future, and tomorrow you see 50 Homer Simpsons all around you. You're amazed how people are limited in the future. It's like people before mobile phones, when there was some guy, he was a long time in jail, 15 years, and he was very disappointed when he got out to the, freedom, because he saw everybody looks at mobile phones, so he wanted to go back to jail. Society is changing and we don't feel this change. We are put in these groups and polarized, and people are becoming increasingly similar. And the base of this is addictions. People are addicted to new media, to smartphones more than to old media. People are addicted to virtual reality more to gaming without virtual reality. And the next step, the companies are investing billions in this new internet, the metaverse, the virtual reality. And I think this is a real threat. The power is shifting to technological companies and AI. And I look at them as independent actors. Of course, it's important to warn against these authoritarian threats of different governments, but the real actor here is big tech. And Michal warns, against companies and their interest. And also he shows the research to warn about potential outcomes of algorithmic recommendations and facial recognitions, which is great. This is the essence of this conference. And the essence is to assess these emerging technologies because we cannot escape them.
Thank you, Ljubisha. And when we speak about these issues and when we speak about digital democracy and online freedoms, I think it's very important to acknowledge that not all populations are affected equally and that there are different populations that face disproportionate challenges in this regard. So I want to invite you, Susan, to offer your reflections on this point.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to join you. This is fascinating work. I'd like to begin by reminding everyone that we are citizens of countries that have signed and ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And human rights is indivisible. So we can't decide 70 years after our ratification that we're going to abandon privacy or abandon slavery or abandon freedom of expression. It's a package. So privacy remains part of the package regardless. And that won't change anytime soon, regardless of what's happening on the ground. In terms of law, privacy will remain part of the human rights package. In terms of access, women Children and the disabled are disproportionately impacted. As we know, I think Michal has just mentioned that there are fewer women than men online, 260 million fewer women than men online. And since the ITU only estimates access every 3 months as online access, we know that there are, in fact, many more women who don't have access online. This prevents them. This is an example of lost opportunities in farming, in medicine, health, in the ability to form networks. And so consequently, women are disproportionately impacted by their lack of access to the internet. The disabled are also disproportionately impacted. And I firmly believe that no child under 12 should have access to a telephone, a cell phone with an internet connection. But I know that that is a very unpopular stance with most 12-year-olds. I also think that vulnerability is extremely evident with respect to children. Lubisha, you were just talking about addiction. Children are far more easily addicted to a range of products, cigarettes, TikTok, you name it. And so they're extremely vulnerable from the very first call or the first click. They're vulnerable to, we know, cyberbullying, trafficking, false advertising, social imaging via TikTok. But most importantly, they are being trained very early on to become citizens in a society run by algorithms. And that's perhaps the greatest danger that we face right now in allowing youth access that is unmonitored. Women also experience embedded discrimination enhanced by algorithmic biases. And I agree with Michal that we want a society, a better society, that privacy, you can call it a fig leaf. I think it's more than a fig leaf. I think it's actually a legitimate right in the same category as freedom of expression or freedom from slavery. And I think racial minorities will also experience increased biases. And finally, the disabled and the elderly are at risk in a society that relies on machine care. There's nothing like human care to increase another human sense of well-being. And isolation is increased amongst the disabled and the elderly if we begin relying on machine care to replace human care. I believe that AI is an excellent tool to do what humans don't do as well, i.e. calculations, for example. But in order to take care of an elderly person, it can only be an enhancer, but not the only tool. And so consequently, there are many ways that the vulnerable experience discrimination, both by not accessing online tools and also through the use of online tools. It's a double-edged sword. We have to think about it carefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. We are supposed to have 2 rounds of questions, but we only have 20 minutes until the end of this panel. So I just want to check something before I start the second round. Are there any questions for our speakers? Who would like to ask questions? Just raise your hands. I thought so. So I'm going to yield my second round of questions because we have so many questions from the audience, and I will open the floor for discussion now. Claudia is the first one who raised her hand, I think.
Yes, my question is for Michael, as in fact relates to his earlier presentation. I may be wrong, but I heard you saying, look, there is no hope. Privacy, it's over. We're not going to be able to protect it. We should just go on and look at what the world is going to be without privacy. I think this is a really sad message to give. I think we can do a lot with regulation. We have done a lot with regulation in other situations. I think it's important to continue the discussion of what sort of privacy, what sort of regulation may help us go through the next many years, in fact, because I think your hope for a more just society across the world where rights won't be infringed for any type of population is yeah, everybody, we all wish for that, but we know that it's not going to happen soon. So I think at the moment, the real instrument we have is to protect privacy. And I don't know what you think about this, but I think the message we should be giving is, let's look into it and let's do it seriously and find a way for us to be able to enjoy the technology, but at the same time to protect especially vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Claudia, so much. So if all our speakers agree, I would like to collect several more questions and then give the panelists a chance to respond to your comments. So let's take 2 or 3 more questions. And I see Dominic raised his hand.
That's very loud, sorry. So I think as a generality, each of you tend to focus more specifically either on government perspective or from a business perspective on the threats to privacy and the digital threat. And from my perspective, however, it's this combination and this tension between both government and private institutions that present together the biggest threat. And so I'm more curious as to each of your perspectives on how these tensions kind of work together, how public organizations, whether they're international communities like the European Union, and national governments specifically protect or violate privacy and human rights, and how the threat also extends to private governance of the digital sphere.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, I see a Polonario over there.
Yeah, I think my question is it's to all of you as well, but also it's a thought provoked by the earlier panel from Mikhail as well. And the question is on whether I think from the points made, I thought of an analogy with maybe like the climate change, where we have the reversal strategies and the adaptation strategies, I guess. So I think there is a realistic approach to, well, these technologies exist. One can go online and read your sentiment and therefore see characteristics about your political view online. How do we adapt to that in parallel to the potential ways to prevent that as well? So I guess that's I at least I understood it like that as that message. But I think my question kind of resonates to the rest of the audience here, in the sense of, in some ways there is a I don't know if it's a threat, but the thing is, the big corporations have, like, we say, well, we all like using Google Maps and we happily share our data in order for the service of Google Maps to work, and we would like to live in a world where the Google Maps service is provided. But the question is, this gives Google way too much more data than other players, and then even like governments or whatever. So we're trusting them to hold that data and to have that edge on so many more people to provide this particular service that we all enjoy. But it doesn't sound like a right balance. Like, it sounds like they have way too much in order to provide this service for free. But what does this free entail? So I'd like to ask about this balance as well, just like the last question, but it's specifically on people holding way too much data in order to provide those services, and how could we potentially handle that?
Okay, I think we can give a chance to panelists to respond to these questions, and then if we have more time, we will take more questions from the audience. So I think Claudia's questions was directed at Michal specifically, so I would like to bring him back.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question. If this was the question about whether we should give up the privacy, I just want to say once again, absolutely, we should not give up the privacy, and we should work on regulation and technology, trying to save as much privacy as possible. What I'm arguing is what the gentleman in the hats mentioned, which is adaptation. We should understand and accept the fact that even the best law, even the best technology will not guarantee us privacy. And in fact, those breaches, I believe, will become easier and more widespread in the future. Now, we can regulate Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon it's extremely difficult to regulate small startups that sometimes don't even know that they're breaking the law, and yet can amass data on millions of customers really quickly. We can regulate companies in Europe and in the United States. It's very difficult to regulate companies beyond our borders. And sometimes governments of other countries would actively encourage and create incentives for companies to misbehave in the Western sphere where privacy is more respected. Also, where it's easy to see while Google or Facebook or Amazon will follow the rules or try to follow the rules if they, as they have a lot to lose, a software engineer that is losing his job or is quitting his job, and a software engineer that can easily, copy on a USB stick or some cloud account data of millions or billions customers, is not going to be as likely to follow those rules. And of course, this is a crime and we should be trying to limit it, but we should be ready for situations of that kind. And of course, those are not new problems. It has, for as long as we were having institutions and organizations, you had people getting secrets out and in a suitcase and copying documents using microfilm and so on. It's just that in the past, you had Cambridge 5, the famous spy ring in the United Kingdom, and they stole whatever it was, 10,000 documents over 10 years or 15 years of functioning. Today, you can imagine a single software engineer stealing millions of documents in minutes. So the damage, the scale of the damage is also unprecedented. So, and I think that the solution to this, apart from trying to regulate and with technology and law, is to try to also, as soon as possible and as hard as possible, try to move towards a society where privacy breaches would result in people just rolling their eyes and not caring who is gay or who is conservative or liberal.
Okay, thank you so much, Michal. And I want to bring in other panelists as well and give them a chance to respond. So both Dominic's and Apollonaria's questions were not directed at any panelist in particular. So feel free to offer your reflection on these perspectives. Susan, do you want to
Thank you.
join?
Thank you. A couple of things. I think often of Elinor Ostrom, the economist who called our attention to the loss of public space, the air, the sea. I'm wondering if we can't think of data differently. Data is a public good. For example, if there isn't a way to step outside minuscule regulation and think of a whole new framework. Now, this may seem impossible at the moment, but giving women the right to vote was also considered impossible 100 years ago. Things do change. People do adjust the way they think about things. We need an adjustment in our thinking. Privacy remains an integral part of fundamental freedoms. And rather than roll our eyes, there should be recourse for people whose data privacy has been breached. It may be a question of who owns the data, and we may need to think about how businesses and governments can work together to provide a different framework for the ownership of data itself. For the moment, there's real reluctance to provide the data subject with ownership of his or her own data. That's something that may need to change in order to address what appears to be the inevitable. We're going to lose our privacy. It's not necessary. It's absolutely unnecessary if we think about this differently. So my contribution on that score.
Yeah, so thanks so much for the questions, and Dominic and Apollinario, I think we can kind of answer both at the same time. Yeah, the tension is incredibly important, right? The platforms have caused legitimate online harms across the globe. They've amassed, too much power through vertical integration and horizontal integration, and also troves of our personal data. And we often see these issues serve as a pretext for governments to then introduce regulation that's either clumsy or intentionally trying to exert more control over the online space, or in some cases lacks foresight, thinking about the NetzDG law in Germany and what it means for the removal of content that was then kind of copied by more autocratic governments, which applied it much more, or trying to apply it much more widely. So I think this tension, is really important in terms of how we think about these issues. And to your point, Apolinario, that it is critical that when we think about solutions, we do think about how to create a online ecosystem that is fairer and allows for more competition between companies and organizations to kind of erode some of the power that the big platforms have amassed. And obviously, it's extremely aspirational. I think we're seeing steps in terms of if you look at like the Digital Markets Act in Europe, it's in the EU. It's hard to know how it will actually impact these platforms when it takes effect, but kind of principles like interoperability, or the idea that you should be able to more easily communicate between platforms, right? You can send an email from a Google account to a Yahoo account, but when you're on platforms, they kind of wall you in. And I think obviously underlying all of this is the business model of, as Shoshana Zuboff has wrote about, of surveillance capitalism that inherently kind of puts our data at risk, and tackling that one is a little bit harder, but it is also something I think we should work towards.
Thank you, Grant. Lyubisha, your reflections.
As you all said, many billions of people use smartphones. Smartphones are an integral part of our lives. And the conclusion would be that this is the most powerful medium. Actually, the recommender systems that expose us to the content, that decide what is shown to us each and every moment when we look at our phones, this is the most powerful social force in the world now at this point. This is my opinion. And the solution is easy. As technology can harm societies and individuals, also it can offer a solution. And that is customizing the recommender systems by societies as a common good, and enabling content which is balanced from all spheres of life. Do not prioritize negative emotions, do not make people angry, and do not make people too addictive. So in my view, algorithms can be set up so they can both serve the interest of the commercial interest of the big tech companies, but also serve the interest of individuals and society. And that's why we signed the Belgrade Digital Freedom Act today.
Thank you so much, Lyubisha. Let's hear from our audience again. Mirjana has the next question.
I was just wondering, listening to the beginning of this. I was just wondering, listening to the beginning of this discussion, how the Europe is faring now on the list that was mentioned, because we had that fuss in Europe a few years ago about the upload filters that were applied. And as I know, that is the story that still is going on. They are now discussing even the upload filters for the chats in a way to protect the children from the predators, but that is also invasion of privacy in a way, because the chats on the platforms were private so far. They didn't belong, their content wasn't something that was monitored. So how about that, about upload filters? How that connects to the freedom of speech and human rights on the internet at the moment?
Okay, thank you, Mirjana. Any more questions? So I think we can have two more questions. So one will be from Mikhail and then Dragan.
my question is about legislation and the human rights, basically. Modern legislation is based on the idea of universality, philosophical idea that the law can be applied to everybody universally. But the data-driven world is based on that precision, precise something, micro-targeting. So the law actually cannot be applied in some cases. Aren't we dealing with a situation when this micro-targeting and this collection of data will shift the legislation towards probability and statistics? For example, laws designed according to statistics and to the algorithms that evolve, not the laws that are universally regulating our rights and our society.
Dragan has the last question, and I have to ask you to be brief. So we have 3 minutes left to hear the last question and then some reflections at least.
Okay, this is a question from Michal. So you mentioned like no man should be above the law. We already don't have this. So the people who are most in position to abuse the data collection that is happening now, they are people who are most exempt from the lack of privacy. Do you think it could be enforceable by law to just make it so that these people are exposed in the same way that we are? So, for example, if you are a president or CEO of a data collecting company, you should be required by law to be monitored 24 hours a day, and then that's streamed to global populations so they can check on you.
That's called paparazzi, and this is precisely what's happening. You know, I'm let's do some wealthy people bashing and talk badly about Elon Musk, but powerful and famous are having much less privacy than the rest of us, and there's much more to gain from invading their privacy as well. So their phones are at risk of constant hacking. The paparazzi is following them around, and you know, intelligence services of countries are interested in stealing their data. So I think in this regard, actually, we have more, we have better, more privilege than the most famous and celebrated people.
And we had 2 more questions. So one regarding the upload filters, and the other one regarding the relationship between micro-targeting and the future legislation efforts. So who would like to take on that? I see Susan.
Yes, so I'm interested actually in both, but I'll answer the second question first very quickly. Fortunately, lawmaking is so messy in this world, in democracies, but also in authoritarian states, that although states do rely on algorithmic data, on probability, on statistics, in the end, it doesn't seem to have much impact. It's backroom politicking that often determines what's going to happen. So for the moment, although there's real concern that governments are over-relying on algorithmic probabilities, in the end, it doesn't always have an impact on the actual lawmaking, as long as humans and not machines are making laws. And then for the uploaded filter, I think Miriam's question is wonderful, except for that I ask any parent in the room if you're comfortable or uncomfortable with your child's ability to access everything online. And so it's a balance. It's going to have to be a balance between the child's rights and the parent's rights. And that issue hasn't been solved. So thank you.
I'm sorry to say this is all the time that we had for this discussion. And Susan, Michal, Ljubisha, and Grant, thank you so much for being the panelists for today. And thank you to our audience. Now we will have a 15-minute break, and we continue with 2 more individual presentations by Walid Al-Sakaf and our friend Nina Kamzi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.